Hey guys, tonight we drift into a tale where the wind hums lullabies through dragon-carved prows and diplomacy smells faintly of herring and damp wool. You find yourself on a narrow fjord in a place with no roads, just salted wind, restless sheep, and a Viking chieftain balancing a scroll on his knee while reading aloud in painfully mangled Latin. He's practicing his diplomatic tone to his goats. One of them nods as if understanding. Another farts. You sit on a sun-warmed stone, the texture like baked bread crust, rough, but somehow comforting. There's lichen growing near your elbow, soft and velvet green, and a distant waterfall murmurs like a sleep spell. Here among gnarled pines and the slow lapping of seawater against hulls, the Norse are tired not from battle, but from boredom. Too many winters of looting churches and singing about it. Their swords are blunt from inaction, and their beards immaculate. That's how long it's been since the last raid. This is a moment in history no one writes down. Not because it isn't important, but because it's too absurdly polite. You are part of a quiet expedition of Viking diplomats, a new and fragile experiment sailing to propose a treaty to a group of monks who've been hiding in a stony monastery clinging to a cliff like a gargoyle in prayer. The chieftain, whose name sounds like someone sneezing underwater, clears his throat and reads again, Pax et aqueductus. The goat looks unimpressed. You hand him a piece of dried apple to boost morale. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love to know what country and time are you listening from right now. Now then, let's slip into something warmer than steel and sharper than swords. A story where Vikings tried diplomacy and accidentally invented a board game. The fjord smells of pine sap and fermented berries. The boats are anchored like sleeping animals, tails, rudders bobbing gently. You pad barefoot across the wooden planks of the main ship, dodging a bowl of porridge someone forgot, and which now hosts its own civilization of ants. The chieftain gathers the crew. They're wearing ceremonial cloaks made from mismatched things, swan feathers, wool dyed with lichen bits of old sails. You included. You wear a tunic that itches in places you didn't know you had. You're told today's mission is to approach the monastery not with torches, but with poetry, and maybe cheese. One of the younger warriors, whose beard still resembles a confused squirrel, whispers, "What if they attack us with scripture?" You remind him, that's why you brought the goats. Apparently, someone decided the surest way to gain favor was to present the monks with livestock that could serve as both companions and milk donors. Also, they're trained sort of to kneel when they hear Gregorian chant. That was an afternoon nobody will forget. So much bleating, so much theology. As you help lower the smaller boat into the water, your paddle cuts a trail through the sea like a finger trailing through dew. There's a serenity here, the kind you only feel in early morning dreams before alarm bells or fire drills. As the monastery comes into view, carved into the gray bones of the cliffside, you catch sight of a figure. A monk, probably, clutching a broom and glaring like someone's just insulted his lentils. The boat creaks. Your goats shuffle. You take a breath that tastes like salt and anticipation. You are here not to fight, but to talk. That thought alone is stranger than any raid. A banner is raised, stitched with the Norse rune for peace, though it might actually say pudding. The embroidery apprentice was new and cross-eyed. Still, the intent is clear. You disembark with the ceremonial gift basket, honeycomb, pressed gooseberries, a roughly translated epic poem with marginal doodles, and of course a small wheel of experimental cheese known as Whispering Odin. It hums slightly in warm weather. The monk greets you with a glance that would curdle stronger cheese. But he says nothing, just gestures for you to follow, and you ascend steps worn smooth by centuries of sandals and secrets. Inside, the air shifts, cooler, like breathing inside a thought. Candles line the hallway like sleepy stars. You hear chanting in the distance, low rhythmic like monks attempting synchronized snoring. You are led to a table made of repurposed driftwood. The grain patterns resemble maps to forgotten places. The chieftain clears his throat, raises his scroll, and promptly drops it into a bowl of barley tea. Nobody moves. The silence is awkwardly dense. Then the monk says something in Latin that might mean, "May peace dwell among fools," and walks away. It's not clear if that's a blessing or an insult. You stay seated watching a goat gently nudge a scroll with its nose, as if offering notes. And just like that, the first round of Viking diplomacy begins not with trumpets or treaties, but with soggy parchment, unsure smiles, and a hopeful wheel of cheese. You don't realize it yet, but this is how it starts. This moment, half ridiculous, half tender, is the first step toward something utterly unexpected. The next morning arrives not with trumpets or sunbeams, but with the delicate clatter of goat hooves against flagstone echoing like an accidental lullaby. You awaken beneath a wool blanket that smells faintly of campfire and marjoram. The monastery's guest chamber is small, its walls thick as bedtime silence. There's no window, only a slit where morning sneaks in like a shy child, bringing a light too bright for dreaming. You rise slowly, joints whispering and tunic rumpled, and pad out to the courtyard. The monks have already begun their day, sweeping the stones with bristle brooms as if polishing the earth itself. One of them hums a melody so old it sounds like wind trapped in a bottle. Today is for gift-giving, and more importantly, for presentation. You're here to offer what might be the strangest peace token in Viking memory, a tapestry of diplomacy, stitched, glued, hammered, and somewhat melted together from ship sails, weathered rope fish scales, moss a few feathers, and what someone swore was diplomatic tinsel. No one questioned it. You helped make it. Sat under torchlight, with calloused hands poking holes in linen, while someone nearby composed poetry about the noble gesture of retiring a sword for a spoon. The tapestry, if you squint, might resemble two sides shaking hands. One side is clearly a Viking muscular braided scowling, even in thread. The other is perhaps a monk or a badger in a hood. The stitching wasn't precise. But the message cooperation is unmistakable. You carry the banner into the refectory where the monks are gathered. Long benches, modest food, rye bread, a thin broth, cheese, slices like pages of an edible book. The Viking chieftain, now draped in a ceremonial cloak that used to be someone's tent, clears his throat. He presents the tapestry with the solemnity of a man about to knight a duck. Silence. Then a cough. A goat bleats. And then one of the elder monks, his robes the color of old parchment, stands. He approaches, peers at the tapestry with narrowed eyes, and reaches out to touch it. A murmur runs through the room. The monks tilt their heads. The Vikings clutch their belts with nervous dignity, and the monk, with the slow precision of someone watering a bonsai tree, nods once and says, "Acceptum." Accepted. You exhale, the goat sneezes, and peace, improbable and smelling vaguely of fish glue, takes its first shaky breath. The next few days pass like dandelion seeds drifting on a summer draft. You and the others are welcomed into the monastery's rhythm, gentle, repetitive quiet, as a lullaby hummed into bread dough. You help with chores. Sweep leaves from the garden path, stir barley in vast kettles. Whisper your name to bees that circle lazily over flowering herbs. But always you notice the quiet tension, the kind that clings to a house after an argument has been paused but not forgotten. The Vikings are trying. Sincerely. But they don't know how to fill the silence with anything but songs about shipwrecks and wolves. So one evening, in a rare moment of shared comfort, the oldest monk brings out an artifact, not gold, not a relic, just a frayed wool blanket. He places it on the table and says it belonged to a peacemaker from 100 winters ago. Then, without a word, he begins stitching something onto it, slowly, his needle looping in and out like a bird weaving a nest. And you're invited to help. One by one, you and the other Norse folk join in. Not because you're good at embroidery, you're not. Someone stabs themselves with a needle and curses in Old Norse so eloquently that a passing goat faints, but because it feels right. The blanket becomes a canvas for symbols, spirals of harmony, tiny sewn boats, stars made from black thread and stubbornness. One warrior embroiders a dragon kissing a dove. Another just sews a meat pie. Symbolic, apparently. It's a strange communion needles instead of swords thread instead of threats. A new peace offering is born, not demanded, not bargained, simply made. You sit beside a monk who smells of soap and candle smoke, and he teaches you how to stitch the rune for stillness. It's more difficult than it sounds. Outside, the sea breathes against the rocks, and ivy rustles against stone like pages turning in a windless room. There's a warmth that grows not loud, not sudden, but slow and certain, like soup thickening or snow falling on pine. And you begin to understand that sometimes diplomacy is not spoken in Latin or shouted across the battlefield. Sometimes it is sown and gifted and quietly placed on the bench beside a stranger folded like a prayer. The monastery, you discover, runs on rhythms too soft to notice at first. There's a bell that rings not loudly, just a dull bronze yawn, when it's time for contemplation or soup, or to gently scold the goats for climbing the herb shelf again. This morning you're invited unexpectedly, and without warning, to share tea with Brother Osric. He's a monk of indistinct age, possibly 50, possibly 150, depending on how closely you inspect the wrinkles. His eyebrows resemble sleeping caterpillars, and his robe is patched so many times it now looks like a map of forgotten islands. He motions for you to sit on a 3-legged stool across from him at a table made from an old door and exactly 1 stone brick. There's a teapot between you, earthenware glazed with what appears to be crushed berries and ash. The tea inside is warm barley and fennel, and it smells somehow like childhood. You sip cautiously, and it tastes like stories waiting to be told. Diplomacy, Brother Osric says, as if tasting the word is a lot like steeping tea. Rush it, and all you get is hot water and disappointment. You nod. You have absolutely no idea what that means. He reaches beneath the table and produces 2 items, a turnip and a riddle. The riddle is spoken, "The more you take, the more I grow." What am I? You blink. The goats nibble grass in the courtyard beyond utterly unhelpful. Osric raises the turnip and sniffs it, as if it contains hidden clues. This apparently is how he settles arguments, through riddles and root vegetables. He offers you the turnip as if it's a talking stick. You accept it with as much dignity as one can muster, while holding a vegetable like it's the sword of diplomacy. You ponder, a hole you finally guess. Osric's eyebrows lift like awnings in a gust of wind. Correct. A quiet gong of approval seems to echo somewhere. Or maybe it's just a bell tied around a goat's neck. This, Osric explains, is how disputes were settled once upon a time, not by raising voices or shields, but by presenting a puzzle. Both sides would sip warm tea and try to outwit one another with wit, not weapons. If neither could solve it, they shared a loaf of bread and considered it a draw. Better to share crusts than curses, he says solemnly. You like that. And so begins your training in what Osric calls riddle diplomacy. You and a few others begin spending time each morning with him sipping strange teas, carrot and clove nettle and mint, and trying to solve increasingly confounding puzzles. Sometimes the riddles are metaphors about clouds or shadows. Other times they involve cabbage theft and hypothetical geese. Once someone brings a puzzle involving 6 wooden cups and a hungry ghost. Each one comes with a small snack. Food calms the mind. Osric insists passing you a barley biscuit shaped like a badger. In the quiet hush of the monastery, this becomes your unexpected battlefield. These slow, funny mornings of warm cups and wrinkled monks, and the slow realization that language can build just as surely as it breaks. One afternoon, Osric invites the Viking chieftain to join. He sits stiffly like a fish in a chair. He doesn't trust the tea, doesn't trust the turnip, but he does trust you. You whisper, "Just pretend it's a strategy meeting. With snacks, it works." He grunts and takes the turnip. The riddle. What has roots that nobody sees is taller than trees, up it goes, and yet never grows. The chieftain frowns, stares at the sky, looks annoyed. You wait. He finally mutters, "A mountain." Osric's smile cracks open like a sunbeam through clouds. Indeed. From then on, diplomacy takes place regularly over tea. Goats stop crashing the sessions. Mostly. The Vikings bring their own snacks, dried fish crackers that smell like honesty and regret, and the monks prepare bread that somehow tastes like forgiveness. Someone starts keeping score, not because it matters, but because it's fun. You lose most of the time, but you don't mind. The warmth from the tea, the rough wood of the table beneath your palms, the steady hum of monks working in gardens nearby, the tickle of ivy brushing against the stone walls like a lullaby with leaves. This is how peace settles into the bones, not with declarations, but with rituals, with shared cups and soft chuckles, with answers found between crumbs and questions spoken like wind through barley. And all the while, without anyone noticing, something begins to form. Something between a game and a treaty, a way to hold argument and joy in the same breath. And as the sun sets behind the western cliffs, bleeding peach and copper into the clouds, you realize something. This may not be how history remembers Vikings, but it is how they began to rest. There are, in the corner of the refectory, a few low shelves, once meant for holy texts and dusty manuscripts, now holding a slightly less sacred collection. Jars of pickled radish, half-whittled spoons, a cracked bowl full of marbles, and one entirely mysterious object made of cheese and apricot that no one dares move. It looks like a sculpture, or a trap. It was left there a week ago by Brother Anshelm, who believed diplomacy required a visual aid. He carved a cube of goat cheese into a block, then attached smaller pieces to represent tiny warriors, dried apricots for shields, almond slivers for spears. He called it the peace puzzle. And as with most great inventions, no one had any idea what it was supposed to do. You're the first to sit beside it and begin to arrange the pieces. You don't know why. Maybe because the goat cheese is less stinky today. Maybe because the apricot shields look like they want something. Or maybe because your hands need something to do while Brother Osric drones on about how silence is the highest form of communication, which, ironically, he says quite a lot. You slide an apricot knight across the shelf toward a block of walnuts. Another monk wanders over and watches, then moves a sliver of cheese. No words, just snacks turned soldiers shuffled like thoughts across a battlefield. Before long, 3 others have joined in. You take turns almost like chess, but with no real rules, just an instinctual rhythm, a sense of motion and consequence. One apricot defeats another by landing on it. A cheese cube falls off the shelf and is solemnly eaten. A walnut is declared king, and then promptly captured by a goat who wandered in at the worst moment. And just like that, the world's first diplomatic board game is born not out of strategy manuals or royal decree, but from food boredom and a need to say something without saying anything. You call it Hvafl, an Old Norse word that might mean shuffle surrender or oops. Nobody's quite sure. Soon the monks begin crafting more permanent pieces. Someone uses pebbles. Someone else carves little wooden fish with angry faces. One monk insists that every piece must have a name and a backstory. You indulge him. There's now a goat figurine named Sir Nibbles, and a sardine who is secretly a wizard. The board is scratched into the long dining table with a knife, and a particularly intense amount of prayer. It's a simple grid, 6 by 6 squares, though it shifts depending on who sets it up. Sometimes it's circular. Sometimes it spirals like a snail with military ambitions. The rules change daily. Sometimes the walnut is the strongest piece. Sometimes it's forbidden. Once someone introduces a jelly bean tax that no one really understands, but everyone agrees sounds important. The point isn't to win. The point is to keep playing, to keep talking through pieces and pawns, through laughter and strategic chewing. You see monks who once barely nodded now slapping the table and declaring check jelly like it means something. Vikings who only grunted now argue over whether diagonal movement is diplomatic or deceitful. A rule book is proposed, then burned ceremoniously after someone spills ink on page 3 and declares it divine intervention. And yet it works. Somehow in the silly solemnity of this edible empire, something real takes root. There's one particular match between Brother Osric and your chieftain that lasts nearly 2 hours. They move slowly pieces, clinking like polite declarations. The goat tries to intervene, is ignored. Eventually, Osric wins by surrounding the Walnut King with 3 crumbs and declaring it a siege of moral pressure. Your chieftain laughs. Actually laughs. It's a sound like gravel being tickled. They shake hands. The game ends. Nothing is solved, and yet everything feels lighter. News of Hvafl spreads through the monastery like butter melting across warm bread. People gather after chores, after prayers, after everything to sit and play. No 2 games are the same. No 2 players agree on what anything means. But they return. Over and over. You realize this game is more than amusement. It's a ritual, a shared language for people too proud or too different to speak plainly. And perhaps that's what diplomacy has always been, not eloquence or treaties, but the willingness to play the same game even if you're not sure of the rules. One night, you sit outside the monastery, with a few of the others under a sky so vast it feels like velvet held up by pinpricks of light. You use small stones and acorns to recreate a match in the dirt. No board, no need. The sea hushes below. A goat snores. Someone hums a half-forgotten hymn. And you think if all wars began with a wheel of cheese and a bowl of tea, perhaps they would end before they started. The trouble with goats is they don't read treaties. This becomes clear on the morning the diplomatic scroll painstakingly scribed by 3 monks, and a Viking who once bit his own hand during a spelling error is trampled twice by a goat named Lumpy. Lumpy had been looking for turnips, or possibly enlightenment. Instead, he left a perfect muddy hoofprint directly over the line that was meant to say, "Parties agree to share fishing rights along the eastern inlet during low tide." Now it simply reads, "Parties agree to share. Goat." And no one can quite agree on whether that's a culinary promise, a livestock alliance, or a very intimate misunderstanding. You are called upon to translate. Unfortunately, you're not fluent in hoofprint. You squint at the smudged ink, tilt your head, even sniff it, as if that might help, and then declare it ambiguous but promising. This is how the first draft of the peace treaty ends up sealed not with wax, but with a faint goat smell and a small illustration of what might be a turnip holding a sword. No one questions it. Everyone is too tired. The monks decide that if God allowed goats into the Nativity, he can allow them into international agreements. The Vikings decide that hoofprints count as official seals as long as they don't belong to a chicken. Chickens are still considered untrustworthy sorcerers by at least one warrior who had a traumatic egg incident in childhood. But the incident brings up a problem no one saw coming. What exactly did we agree to? A meeting is held. Long tables, steamed broth, spoons clinking like nervous coughs, and on the table the smudged treaty smelling faintly of goat and regret. You sit among them watching as both sides argue not about what they want, but about what they meant. It says we surrender fishing rights. No, it says we share them. That's a hoofprint. A blessing, perhaps, the monks quote scripture. The Vikings quote grandma. Both claim to be right. And so the room fills with the sort of noise that isn't quite fighting, but sounds like two libraries disagreeing very quietly in Latin and grunts. Eventually, Brother Osric stands. He clears his throat and says, "Perhaps the words are not the problem. Perhaps it is the absence of the game." Everyone stares. He gestures toward the board, the Hvafl grid still etched into the wood from last night's match. What if he proposes, slowly, we play for the meaning? And just like that, logic steps out, and whimsy strolls in wearing a goat-shaped hat. The idea is met with silence, then reluctant nods, then curious excitement, because truthfully they all want the game to matter, to count for something. So the terms of the treaty are redrafted not in words, but in positions. Each disputed clause becomes a set of pieces. Fishing rights. That's 3 fish-shaped tokens and a walnut with a tiny hat. Livestock ownership represented by a square of wool and a carved pig someone made with their teeth. Monastery paths. A row of pebbles and one smug acorn. And they play. Moves are made. Arguments dissolve into laughter. At one point, a monk dramatically sacrifices his goose token just to spite a Viking who mocked his sandals. The result, a treaty not written but played. Every clause remembered not by ink but by gesture, tension, sacrifice, and triumph. The final positions of each piece are sketched onto parchment this time by someone holding a goat at bay with one hand. A new kind of agreement is born, a game treaty. A living document. One that can be replayed, restaged, even reinterpreted like poetry, like music, like dreams. Word spreads, not through heralds but through travelers and merchants who pass through and whisper they play their laws now. And everywhere the tale goes, it grows. In one village, a blacksmith claims the acorn represents tax exemption. In another, children create their own version, using bits of cloth and dry beans, inventing alliances on the fly. One fisherman scrawls rules on driftwood, nails it to his boat, and declares the sea under protection of the great sardine general. None of it is consistent, but all of it is understood. Back at the monastery, you wake one morning to find the treaty board dusted with pollen from a nearby window. Tiny yellow stars on each square. As if the game is blooming, you sweep it clean with your sleeve. Gently, reverently. Because you realize now that in trying to avoid war, these people didn't just sign a peace, they built it. Square by square. Play by play. Even the goats now seem more at ease. Lumpy no longer chews documents. He just watches, as if waiting for his turn. And when he finally nudges a token with his nose, you don't stop him. You simply say, "Your move." Rain arrives not with thunder, but with a sigh. It creeps in during the night, draping the monastery in a silver hush like a long, wet thought. You lie awake beneath your goat-wool blanket, listening to it patter on the stone tiles and drip from the eaves in slow, thoughtful rhythm. Every drop seems to murmur something, perhaps remember me, or play again tomorrow. When you rise, the world is different. Outside puddles reflect the sky like tiny temporary windows into other realms. The garden path is a river of mud and mint leaves. The goats look fluffier, somehow like damp philosophers pondering the meaning of umbrellas. And in the courtyard, the Hvafl board has vanished beneath a blanket of rain. But what hasn't vanished are the players. The monks, the Vikings, even Brother Osric are gathered beneath the overhang, squinting at a new board someone has drawn into the dust of the old grain shed floor. It's too dark, too damp, and someone's used stale breadcrumbs as pieces, but no one minds. The game, like the piece, has become portable, recreatable, more spirit than structure. Then a gust of wind bursts through the open gate, and with it a scroll, or rather pieces of one. Torn, soggy, flapping like sleepy birds. A boy chases them in panting. His tunic is patched and his shoes are wet paper, but his face beams like someone who has discovered a lost language. Found these, he says, holding up a satchel full of tokens and scribbles, from the beach. Washed in with driftwood and fish bones. He dumps the contents onto a bench. Apricot knights, pebble kings. Cheese pawns now fossilized by salt and time. They recognize the pieces. From the very first Hvafl set, the one that had been left too close to the windowsill weeks ago. The one no one thought to protect when the storm rolled in. Apparently, the game had decided to go exploring. You kneel beside the boy. Among the artifacts, you find something unexpected. A small piece of parchment stained and wrinkled with a child's handwriting. The sea can't read, but it still plays. No one knows who wrote it. Maybe the waves did. But from that day on, Hvafl begins to change. Where once it had been a curious ritual of monks and Norsemen, now it becomes a wildfire of invention. Children from the nearby village arrive with pockets full of improvised tokens, clay beads, burnt twigs, mushroom caps. A traveling merchant stops by and insists on using coins and roasted beans. One goat tries to play with snail shells. It's not very good, but no one says anything. Each person brings something new. A farmer paints boards on the back of broken doors. A sailor carves one into the inside of his oar. Someone sews a game into the hem of their cloak, just in case they find themselves in a long argument during a cold walk. And with every version the rules twist and bloom. Some play to win. Some play to lose gracefully. Others say the goal is to have your opponent smile before the game ends. That's worth more than a walnut king. You begin to see the game everywhere. Scratched into barn floors. Whispered about in cheese shops. Argued over beside wells. It spreads the way music does, or laughter rarely in straight lines, and never exactly the same. Even the monks start keeping a record. Not of rules, but of variations. Each page of the ledger reads like a dream journal. In the village of Windthorn, they use red berries and play at sunrise. Children in fair weather bind their boards to driftwood and play floating games in buckets. In Appleford, a dog is considered a wild card. You contribute your own in-the-rain play with caution. Wet apricots become missiles. Of course, not everyone agrees. One Viking, deeply offended by a loss involving a pebble queen and a sacrificial honeycomb, storms off and declares Hvafl a monk's trick and a goat's folly. He returns the next day with a custom rulebook and a smug expression. Soon, your peaceful game is spawning spirited debates across dinner tables and fishing docks. Some argue for standardization. Others insist the chaos is part of the charm. One bard writes a song declaring that Hvafl's only rule is that whoever takes it too seriously must sit out for 3 turns. You like that one. Through it all, something becomes clear: the game has become larger than its origin. No longer bound to scrolls or treaties or even boards, Hvafl is now a living language, a conversation in objects, a soft way of saying, "I see you, I respect you, shall we play?" And just as the rain eventually gives way to sunlight, glistening on puddles like polished coins, the world around you shifts too. Fewer weapons, more tokens, fewer arguments, more board corners chalked on tree trunks and stone benches. Somehow the diplomacy that began in nervous goat bleats and stitched blankets has become a movement, a slow revolution, one that smells faintly of apricot and hope. And somewhere probably far from here, a child you'll never meet is scratching a new version into the dirt and whispering to their friend, "Let's play peace." The noble arrived on a Tuesday. No one was expecting him. That's often how nobles arrive, like strong winds through cracked windows, wearing boots too shiny for walking, and expressions practiced in long mirrors. His name was something like Lord Dandelion, or perhaps Sir Hvafl of Somethingshire. You never quite caught it. He arrived with 2 attendants, a steed that looked like it disapproved of everything, and a collection of hats more ambitious than necessary. He came because he'd heard rumors. Tales whispered by spice traders, hummed by flute-playing children, and once accidentally mentioned in a monk's letter home, the Vikings are playing something instead of fighting. I think it involves cheese. Naturally, this stirred royal curiosity, diplomacy through dairy impossible. And yet, fascinating. He was offered tea, declined it, was offered the blanket of diplomacy, touched it once and sneezed. Then he was shown the game. At first he was unimpressed. Pebbles and apricots, he asked, poking a piece with the tip of a quill, as though it might bite. But then someone invited him to play. You watched as Brother Osric explained a few of the basics, none of which by that point were truly consistent anymore. The noble waved his hand as if to say, "I am beyond instructions," and proceeded to make a move that accidentally positioned his almond soldier in direct conflict with a cheese bishop. No one corrected him. The noble squinted, moved again, then again. Minutes passed. Something shifted. A frown appeared, not one of disapproval but of intense curiosity. His back straightened, his eyebrows danced. He made noises like humph and aha, and once by the tail of Saint Cabbage. By the end of the match, he was thoroughly asleep. Not out of boredom, but from sheer cozy contentment. His hat had fallen sideways, his teacup remained untouched, and his final move, an elegant slide of the Walnut King into a friendly apricot square, had left everyone else slightly stunned. He awoke after 37 minutes of dignified snoring, blinked at the board, and whispered, "Genius." Thus the game was declared worthy. Not by scholars, not by scribes, but by the strange, dreamy declaration of a nobleman with hat hair and a smile of confused delight. That was all it took. Soon after, letters began arriving, not formal ones sealed in wax, but curious little notes tucked into bread deliveries and wool shipments. Heard of a monk's game near the fjords. Can I try? Do you need apricots, or is dried fig acceptable? My goat moves diagonally. Is that legal requests poured in? Nobles, pages, foreign visitors, all intrigued, all asking the same thing. Can we play? You organize a demonstration. Not to show off, but to share. You set up boards in the courtyard, now dried from the last rain, shaded by linen sails that flutter like gossip. Monks teach how to place pieces. Vikings offer commentary filled with metaphor and suspicious logic. Someone brews tea that smells like apples and thunder. A goat is dressed in ceremonial garb. No one knows why. It becomes a festival, not of noise but of curiosity. Games sprout like mushrooms after rain. Laughter echoes through the halls. Old rivals share fig biscuits and argue over the ethics of sacrificing a pebble queen. The noble returns with more nobles. Some play, some observe. Some simply lie on the grass and listen to the sound of tokens sliding over wood like distant rain tapping softly on the lid of the world. One declares it a form of strategic meditation. Another insists it must be converted into a courtly sport. But Osric, ever gentle, simply pours more tea and reminds them the point is not to win. The point is to keep playing. Eventually, a royal scribe arrives to record it all. He watches scribbles, sketches, diagrams, then nods sagely and writes in large letters, "Hvafl, the gentle sport of uncertain rules." And suddenly Hvafl is no longer just a game. It is a cultural moment. It enters noble salons and dusty academies. A version involving painted stones and velvet pouches appears in a duchess's parlor. Another is played in a vineyard with wine corks and olive pits. Someone even tries to incorporate birds. That one ends poorly. But no matter how it spreads, no matter how polished or altered, it always traces back to this monastery, these cloisters, these afternoons under whispering leaves and goat-stamped parchment. You watch it all with a kind of distant wonder. Not pride exactly, something softer, a quiet knowing. Like planting a seed and seeing it turn into a forest where strangers now gather and nap beneath its shade. Hvafl has become more than a distraction. It is a place. A pause, a small deliberate resistance to haste. And one evening, as the noble prepares to leave, he pauses beside you. "You may have accidentally civilized us," he says, brushing a speck of cheese from his sleeve. You smile, shrug, and reply, "We were just trying to avoid an argument." Arguments like pickled herring have a way of lingering, even in a place so steeped in peace that the goats nap in hammocks and the moss grows in heart shapes on the walls. Disagreements still find their way in on slippered feet, with soft voices and well-meaning brows furrowed in deep theological concentration. It begins with a night, or rather the way a night moves. Brother Anselm, who once hand-copied an entire psalm upside down without noticing, insists the night piece in Hvafl must move in a neat L shape, 2 squares forward, 1 to the side. It is elegant, he declares, and represents the journey of the soul. But Björn, a Viking who sharpens spoons for fun and once named his beard Torvald, strongly disagrees. He believes the knight should hop over pieces entirely shouting "ho" there, vocally or spiritually each time. Neither is willing to budge. A debate begins in the corner of the refectory and slowly spreads like jam across a breakfast table. Soon others join. Some monks argue for diagonal swoops symbolic of heavenly ascension. A merchant passing through claims in her village, knights are round and roll like pebbles. A small boy insists the knight is actually a turnip and should move underground. Everyone brings something. Rules are quoted, variations drawn in the dirt, one goat eats a diagram, and still no consensus. For the first time in weeks, the game begins to feel tense. Pieces are moved with suspicion. Games are paused mid-match until a ruling is declared. Someone introduces a new piece entirely, a mediator, that just stands between the knight and everyone else holding a very tiny flag. You suggest a compromise 2 knight types, the Osric knight for L-shapes and scripture, and the Torvald knight for unpredictable leaps and shouting. This solution delights no one, but offends even fewer. It's adopted reluctantly, like a stray dog that turns out to be really good at singing. Still, the monastery feels unsettled. There's murmuring in the halls, passive-aggressive footnotes in the shared Hvafl ledger. Someone carves "true knights don't gallop into a bench." Someone else crosses it out and replaces it with "all knights are valid." Osric calls a council. Not a council of war or law, but of play. The idea is simple: host a grand match where every version of the night is used. Let the game itself decide. Let the tension dissolve, not through decree, but through participation. You prepare the board, not just any board, a massive one, chalked across the entire courtyard, squares the size of cloaks, pieces big enough to be carried. It's part performance, part celebration, part fever dream. The monks make banners. The Vikings craft tokens from logs and barrels. The goats are kept at a respectful distance, but bleat with anticipation. When the day comes, the air smells of bread and expectation. The two sides enter like pageant royalty. Anshelm, with his scrolls and pointed sandals. Björn with a helmet made of bread dough for intimidation, he claims. The crowd settles in the shade, chewing quietly and pretending not to take sides. The match begins, and it is glorious. Each knight L-shaped or leaping makes its case with every move. Some triumph, others tumble. At one point, a knight accidentally knocks over a rook, which lands in the soup of a bystander who declares the event exquisite chaos. People cheer, not for winners, but for clever ideas, for beautiful blunders, for knights who try their best and bow out with dignity. The match ends in a draw, but no one is disappointed. In fact, they're delighted, because suddenly something becomes clear. The variety is the rule. Hvafl isn't a game with edges. It's a river, a story told differently by every voice, a board that bends. From that day on, arguments shift. They soften, become invitations instead of positions. Now when someone disagrees about a move, they don't argue. They ask, "Want to try it your way next round?" And more often than not, the answer is yes. Because the game, like peace, isn't about being right. It's about staying at the table, making room, shifting the rules when they no longer fit the story being told. That night, as stars bloom over the hilltops and lanterns flicker in the windows, you pass the board in the quiet hallway. A few pebbles have been left mid-game. No names, no score, just potential. You move one, just to see what happens next. No one quite remembers who suggested the festival. Maybe it was the cheese merchant with the musical sneeze, or perhaps the novice monk who embroidered peace treaties onto pillowcases. But the idea caught like a spark on parchment, a gathering to unify the rules of Hvafl once and for all. Of course, it was doomed from the beginning. The festival of Hvafl, as it came to be called, was meant to be a joyous thing, a gentle congress of minds and breadcrumbs. People from 3 valleys, 2 harbors, and 1 suspiciously competitive beekeeping commune arrived with boards under arms and tokens rattling in pouches, boxes, sacks, and even hollowed-out loaves of bread. The monastery courtyard was transformed overnight. Colorful fabrics were draped over stone walls. Tokens glinted like constellations across tables of every shape and height. A chalkboard was erected reading Hvafl Rule Unification Draft, all ideas welcome. Below that, in smaller writing, accept goats as bishops. We've tried that. It ended poorly. You, of course, are part of the planning committee, which mostly means making sure the honey doesn't melt, and ensuring the goat known as Chairman Bleep doesn't eat the scorecards. The first day begins with excitement. Demonstrations of local variants take place: the spiral board from Riverbend, the circular Hvafl of Stonefoot Abbey, the sand-drawn beach version from the south coast. There's even a floating Hvafl board tied together with reeds and driftwood gently bobbing in the monastery's rainwater cistern. For a moment, it feels magical. There are children playing beside elders, warriors teaching priests how to bluff with apricots. A bard sings ode to the whispering rook while juggling tokens. Someone brings a token shaped like a bear wearing spectacles, and no one knows what it does, but everyone loves it. Then comes the meeting. Dozens of players seated in rows, scrolls unrolled, opinions aired. You're there watching the enthusiasm slowly simmer into tension. It begins politely enough. I believe the king should never move backwards. In my village, that's treasonous. Backwards kings represent humility. We outlawed the king altogether. Too hierarchical. Someone brings up scorekeeping. Chaos ensues. Some say Hvafl should never have winners. Others argue for points tallies or goat-judged poetry contests. One man shouts, 3-turn piece exchange, and is escorted out for excessive excitement. The chalkboard quickly becomes unreadable. Arrows point to arrows pointing to question marks. Someone erases everything and just draws a turnip. By mid-afternoon, the crowd has split into factions. The orthogonalists want only straight-line movement. The diagonals advocate zigzag everything. The Circle League insists the board itself must be round to reflect the eternal cycle of potatoes. A minor skirmish breaks out near the apple cider stand over whether pieces should bow before capturing each other. Someone introduces a 12-sided token called the wobbler, which rolls unpredictably and bites people. Peace, ironically, begins to fray, until Osric stands. He does not shout, he does not scold. He simply walks to the messy chalkboard, stares at it for a long, long moment, then picks up a piece of white chalk and draws a blank square. One perfect empty square. He turns and says, "Let this be the rule." Everyone stares. Someone coughs. He continues gently, "Every game begins with possibility, not certainty. We come not to capture the rules, but to release them." He leaves the square blank and walks away. At first, no one claps. No one speaks. Then a child walks up and draws a pebble in the square. Then a monk draws a fish. Then a Viking draws a dragon. The chalkboard becomes once again a game. No one tries to fix it. They just keep adding to it. By sunset, the rule unification meeting has transformed into something else entirely. A celebration. A patchwork of possibility. People return to their boards. They play into the twilight beside candlelight under banners of quiet absurdity. Someone declares the square board sacred. Another proposes a new game, where each piece is a different kind of weather. The goats are finally allowed to judge matches not based on points, but on enthusiasm and snacks provided. No rules are finalized, no treaty is signed, but the peace deepens. Because perhaps the act of agreeing to disagree beautifully, whimsically, and with great snack breaks is itself a form of harmony. That night, as you rest under a tapestry stitched with runes and riddles, you hear the sound of tokens sliding across wood. A lullaby of movement. The game still being played, and the blank square still waiting. The thing about ancient stones is they don't care. They don't care about goats. They don't care about treaties. They certainly don't care whether the knight hops or gallops. But sometimes when the afternoon sun hits just right, and the moss shifts like a sigh, they whisper things anyway. It happens the day after the festival, when the monks begin sweeping the courtyard, brushing away apricot pits and walnut husks, and one unfortunate cheese token that melted during a particularly intense match. You ever the curious helper take up a broom and wander toward the old well at the edge of the cloisters, the one rarely used more ornament than utility, shaded by ivy that hums with bees and a quiet sort of wisdom. There, beneath a weather-worn bench and the scattered remains of someone's game board sketched in soot, your broom catches on something flat and carved. You kneel, fingers brushing away dust and centuries. A board, not chalk, not charcoal stone, faint etchings, worn squares, symbols that resemble Hvafl, but older, stranger. Here a square within a spiral. There a rune that looks like laughter frozen in stone. Tiny pictographs, goats, ships, trees, moons, and in the very center a piece of obsidian still warm from the sun, resting exactly where a king would stand. You sit back, breath caught somewhere between your ribs and your throat. Brother Osric appears, as he often does, silently and holding a carrot. He peers down at the discovery and says, "Ah." Then, after a long pause, it seems the game remembered itself. Later, under torchlight and scholarly murmurs, you learn what little the records can offer. The stone board predates the monastery, predates the village. Some say it was carved by pilgrims. Others whisper about druids or hill children with laughing eyes. One monk insists it's a relic from a dream someone once had too loudly. But one thing is clear, Hvafl was not invented. It was rediscovered, played by people long before language had rooms to sit in. Not always with apricots, not always with goats, but always with purpose. Always as a way to understand. A way to sit across from another human, look them in the eye, and say, "Let's make something together." The revelation doesn't change the game, not really, but it deepens it. Suddenly, each match feels layered. As if you're not just playing for yourself, but for all those unknown players who once moved tokens beneath the same stars. The ones who scratched boards into cave floors, who used leaves, or bones, or stones shaped like questions. It makes the act sacred, but not in a solemn way, more like how a child treasures a dandelion, reverently but with laughter close behind. The stone board becomes a quiet place. Not a museum piece, not a relic, just another table, another square. Players come to it in the cool hush of early morning or the soft violet of dusk. They place their pieces gently. Speak less. Listen more. The rules are not written, only remembered. Someone starts calling it the listening board. There you don't just play, you ask. You ask what kind of piece is possible today. You ask what kind of move invites understanding. You ask where you end, and the other begins, and if for a little while those lines might blur. One evening you sit with a stranger who traveled 3 valleys just to touch the board. You don't speak the same tongue, but the pieces do. You trade moves like secrets. She plays a cedar cone. You answer with a berry. She laughs when you sacrifice a pebble knight to save a moss token. The game ends in a draw. Or maybe it doesn't end at all. You both leave a piece behind. Not as a prize, but as an offering. And soon others do the same. The listening board becomes speckled with these tokens pieces from other lands, other hands, other hearts. No longer just a game, but a mosaic of stories. A quiet archive of all the ways people have chosen not to fight. And late at night, when the stars lean close, and even the goats have stopped gossiping, you pass the board again. You see the flicker of candlelight on obsidian. You hear the whisper of movement. And you know someone is still playing, even if the players are long gone, even if the pieces are memory and dust. The game goes on. And so does the peace it builds. No one expected the bards to get involved. At first they came merely to watch, leaning on lyres, tapping tambourines, absently scribbling poetic fragments about goat-led diplomacy and edible empires. But soon inevitably the allure of Hvafl crept into their rhymes, and then into their verses, and finally into their tavern sets. You hear the first Hvafl ballad while passing a firelit inn on the edge of the village. A voice smooth as old velvet and twice as warm drifts through the open shutters. When the apricot marched and the walnut did fall, the goat wore the crown and then ate it all. The pebble queen sighed and the bishop took tea, and peace was declared with a biscuit and brie. Inside the patrons are humming along. It's oddly catchy. You step in and sure enough on the wall behind the bar is a hand-painted Hvafl board, lovingly mismatched. The pieces are corks, buttons, dried fruit, and one very suspicious jelly bean. The bard on stage wears a feathered cap, and an expression of pleased irreverence. Between songs, they tell tales not of warlords and betrayals, but of games that ended in joyful confusion, of treaties that began with goats of matches so evenly played they were declared art. More bards follow. Soon taverns across the countryside become theaters of strategy. Musicians compete not just in melody, but in metaphor. Some sing of specific matches like the legendary standoff, where both players accidentally played their final pieces into the same square and, rather than argue, shared a snack and married each other the next day. Others write elegies for lost tokens. One particularly mournful tune laments the tragic rolling of the Obsidian King off a cliff during a windy picnic game. But most of all, they craft songs of strategy. Yes, actual ballads instructing players on clever openings, poetic defenses, and legendary bluffs. Each line a tip, each chorus a memory. You hear one called The Whispering Square that advises never trust a token shaped like lunch. It may be bait, not just a hunch. And if your foe plays 3 in line, move not your piece, but pour some wine. Another favorite becomes known simply as the Sardine Gambit, warning of the risks of opening with edible tokens when goats are present. These songs begin as jokes, of course. But over time, players start remembering them, quoting them mid-match, singing softly as they slide a berry pawn across a weathered board. Music and movement entwine. Matches become theatrical. Some players bow before beginning. Others narrate their games in meter. A few bring instruments to accompany particularly bold plays. And always somewhere in the crowd, a bard is taking notes. You attend one match where each move is punctuated by drum beats and audience gasps. The final piece is placed with a whispered rhyme, and the crowd erupts into applause. No one remembers who won. Everyone remembers the story. Hvafl becomes not just a pastime, but a performance, a shared myth in the making. Back at the monastery, Osric watches these developments with a bemused smile. I suppose it was always music, he murmurs one afternoon, while watching 2 children duel with rhymes and buttons. You nod. Because that's what it has become, a way to sing peace into being. To tell a better story, one token at a time. You start keeping your own ledger now. Not of wins, but of games that sang. A match played during a thunderstorm, with tokens made of wax. A 4-way game where everyone kept switching sides. The time someone played an entire match in silence, blinking once for every move. And your favorite A game, where the board was drawn in snow and every piece melted before it could be captured. The players just watched the snow fade and whispered, "Draw." And so the songs grow. They spread farther than tokens ever could. Long after the pieces are gone, the music remains. Soft refrains hummed by travelers, choruses sung at weddings, lullabies crooned to children about pebble queens, and the day the game was played by moonlight, and everyone forgot to keep score. One evening, you sit beneath the stars carving a new token from cherry wood. You hum a melody you heard in a village far away. A song about a move so beautiful it made an enemy weep. And in that moment, it hits you. Peace when played, enough becomes music. And music when shared, enough becomes memory. And memory, well, that's how the game always wins. And now somehow you are a diplomat. Not by appointment or oath, not by seal or signature. Simply by habit. You carry a foldable Hvafl board in your satchel sewn into canvas like a secret map. Your pockets jingle with mismatched tokens, 1 pebble from the listening board, 1 apricot carved with a tiny crown, a goat-shaped coin from a bard's tip jar, and a shell that once served as a queen before someone's dog mistook it for lunch. This is how peace is made now, not in chambers echoing with proclamations, but in kitchens, under trees, on ferry decks, and beside drifting campfires. Anywhere there is ground to scratch a board into, there is room for a treaty. It starts small. You visit a village where two families haven't spoken in 6 years over a dispute about boundary stones and a duck. You set up the board on a crate of onions. No lecture, no sermon. Just a gentle shall we play. By the end of the match, the duck is asleep in someone's lap, and one of the old men is explaining his opening strategy like it's the most important story in the world. They forget why they argued. Or rather, they remember, but decide the game is more interesting. In another town, you're asked to intervene in a tax dispute. The mayor demands points. The baker demands crumbs. You propose a match on the condition that the loser buys dinner. It ends with laughter-spilled cider and a new local law called the Crumb Compromise, which no one fully understands, but everyone agrees sounds poetic. Soon board game diplomats become a thing. Not officially, of course. But when disputes arise over wells, wandering goats, fishnets, noise, feathers, weddings, weather, or where to place a new privy, someone inevitably says, "Get the Hvafl board." And they do. And peace, more often than not, follows. Not always. There are stubborn hearts, bitter histories. Sometimes a match begins and ends in silence. Sometimes someone flips the board and storms off. Sometimes a goat eats the king mid-strategy, and everyone agrees to postpone negotiations until after lunch. But even then, the act of trying matters. Because Hvafl diplomacy isn't about neat resolutions. It's about creating a space, no matter how brief, where listening becomes more important than winning. You are invited to other places now. Bigger places. Port cities where languages tangle like fishing nets. Mountain passes where tensions are older than moss. Even courts, yes, royal courts. You step into marble halls wearing wool and carrying a board that smells faintly of jam. Nobles scoff until you place the first token, and suddenly politics softens into possibility. One day you stand between two generals. They've been circling war like moths around a flame neither of them wants to light. You offer them pieces shaped like boats and birds. Tell them you each move first. Together, they hesitate, then nod. The match lasts 4 hours. No one speaks. By the end, one general lays down his final piece and says, "I've never understood you more." And just like that, the torches of war are dimmed. No treaties signed, no territory exchanged, just understanding quiet, warm, and profound. Word spreads, not through proclamations, but through storytelling. There's a whisper now they played Hvafl instead. And in more and more places, that's enough. Children draw boards in sand. Merchants carry portable sets alongside scales and spices. Fishermen carve tokens during long nights at sea. Each match is a possibility, a language, a lullaby of reason. And in all of it, you are simply there. Not leading. Just offering. You begin keeping a journal. A collection of matches, played stories, heard rules invented on the spot. You name your book, The Atlas of Peace, played slowly. And you realize something strange wherever Hvafl spreads, a kind of gentleness follows. Not a weakness, a wisdom. Because those who play often begin to ask better questions. Of others, of themselves. What am I defending? What am I trying to protect? Can I move forward without harm? And those are questions war cannot answer. But a game played slowly. Perhaps it can. The road to Byzantium is paved with fig's feathers and philosophical detours. You arrive after weeks of travel, the Hvafl board tucked in your satchel, a dozen tokens wrapped in cloth, each carrying the fingerprints of a dozen stories. The city itself spills across the sunlit hills like a painting in motion, domes catching light, like polished coins, markets breathing spices and silk, and somewhere far off the sea exhaling against marble like an old friend. You've been invited, though no one said quite by whom. A letter arrived folded like an origami elephant and smelling of rosewater with only a line of poetry, and a place, come where the mosaics bloom, and even the pigeons debate. Byzantium does not disappoint. Here Hvafl has already arrived. But not as you knew it. The version played in the imperial gardens involves miniature catapults. Yes, actual tiny siege weapons carved from bone and strung with threads of golden hair. The tokens are exquisitely detailed, tiny lions, tiny philosophers, even tiny goats wearing miniature laurels. The board itself is circular, made of inlaid lapis and onyx, and spun slightly between turns, as if the cosmos itself is participating. You watch your first match in silence. The Empress sits beneath an olive tree, wearing shoes that look incapable of touching dirt. She places a rook-shaped hummingbird on the board, then launches it across the grid with a flick of her fan. It lands perfectly on a philosopher token. The crowd gasps, then applauds. A nearby eunuch faints gracefully. You're stunned. This is not Hvafl. And yet it is. It has changed, adapted, embellished. It sings in a new key, but the melody is unmistakable. When they invite you to play, you sit barefoot in the grass and place your first token, a pebble from the listening board, back home. The Empress smiles. No catapults, no flourishes, just you, and her, and the board. And for that game, everything softens. You trade moves with the calm of people reading poetry aloud in a garden. She sighs when you block her bishop with a berry. You grin when she sacrifices a crown to protect a piece shaped like a teacup. When it ends, she claps once gently and says, "Your version feels like listening." You nod. "Yours feels like opera." She laughs and declares the game a most diplomatic duet. And so your stay extends. You play with scribes who record each move in ink made from saffron and regret. You match wits with children who insist each piece has a secret wish. You attend a salon where Hvafl is interpreted as astrological philosophy, and someone weeps when their goat ascends to Capricorn ascending. You adapt, learn, teach. In a bathhouse, a game is played using steam patterns on marble tiles. In the marketplace, a street variant involves vendors shouting moves while juggling produce. In the catacombs, you match pieces in flickering torchlight and realize here too people long to connect without conquering. Your presence sparks something. They begin blending styles, boards painted like mandalas, tokens scented with myrrh, rules that shift based on the phase of the moon. And you begin to understand Hvafl is not a game that spreads, it awakens. In each place it arrives, it reveals what was already there, a desire for play, for pause, for gentle reckoning. Byzantium becomes a symphony of boards. You leave behind tokens in courtyards and libraries. One is placed in a reliquary, another is embedded in a mosaic. A child carves one into the base of a statue and names it Sir Pebbington III. When you depart, the Empress gives you a box, inside a token made of glass and feathers. For the wind, she says. You ask, what does it do? She shrugs, changes direction. You laugh, pocket it, and begin the long journey home. Along the way, you stop in unfamiliar villages. Show the game to new hands, hear new stories, and at each board, you're reminded you are not bringing Hvafl to them. They already had it in some form. You're just giving them a name for the thing their hearts already played. The old hut is still there, moss-draped, leaning slightly to one side as if listening for news from the earth. The shutters creak like tired knees when the wind shifts. Ivy hangs from the eaves in braided ropes, the kind only time can weave. And in the corner, right where the hearth once warmed, so many soggy cloaks, sits the board. Your board. The original, or what's left of it. The etchings are faded, the corners softened by elbows and candle wax and years of hopeful hesitation. The apricot token, half-eaten by ants and memory, rests in the center square untouched since the last match played here. A game that had no ending, only silence. Tonight, though, it will be used again. Because tonight the players return. The monk with trembling hands who once stitched doves into blankets of parley. The chieftain with a beard, now white as almond milk, who learned to bluff with berries and walk away with his pride intact. And you, older now. Not in the mirror, though, that too, but in the way your fingers hesitate before placing a token, not because you doubt, but because you remember. You set the kettle over a small fire. Steam rises. The scent of mint and barley tea curls like a question mark above your head. They arrive with nothing but satchels and stories. No guards, no goats, no audience, just boots softened by distance and eyes already smiling. You greet each other not with words but gestures. An offered cup, a hand on a shoulder, a pebble pressed gently into a palm. No rules are declared, no score is kept. You all remember how to play. The board becomes alive again, piece by piece, memory by memory. The apricot token stumbles immediately into a trap, eliciting a shared groan. A rook is moved purely for aesthetics. A knight is placed, then replaced, then offered as tribute to the pot of tea. At one point, the chieftain tries to bring up politics. You all boo him. He laughs, because this isn't about policy anymore. It's about presence. Moves are made slowly, deliberately, sometimes only after long pauses where someone stares at a piece and says, "Do you remember when we played that match in the grain shed during the thunderstorm?" And everyone nods, and one person adds, "And the goat made the final move," and you all fall apart, laughing. The match is secondary. This is a reunion disguised as strategy, a lullaby disguised as logic. It gets later. Lanterns are lit. The shadows grow long and familiar. The hearth, once cold, begins to crackle faintly with coals you don't remember lighting. You reach the midpoint of the game, and someone stops. Not because they can't go on, but because they don't need to. The match doesn't finish. It just rests, like an instrument laid down after the final note lingers too sweetly to be followed. You all sit back the board between you, glowing faintly in the warm light. Steam from the kettle curls above your heads like old smoke signals. No one says we should do this again. Because you already have. You always will, even when the board is gone. Even when the pieces return to their elements, pebble wood, apricot feather, the game plays on in pauses and courtesies, in the soft refusal to escalate, in the kindness of letting someone take back their move. Before you part, each of you leaves a token behind, not as a trophy, not as a claim, as a message. You leave yours in the center square, a smooth stone from the listening board inscribed with the faintest carving of a wave. Because after all this time, that's what Hvafl has been, a tide, coming in, going out, bringing people together, smoothing the sharp edges, making room for new footprints. You close the door gently behind you. The hut sighs. The pieces gleam one last time in the firelight as if saying, "Well played." Far from the fjords, beyond the reach of treaties and tales down a lane, that even maps have forgotten, a child kneels beneath an old tree. The tree is enormous, its trunk the width of 4 hugs, its bark lined with the grooves of seasons long gone. Leaves flicker overhead like green laughter. Its roots weave in and out of the earth like question marks searching for punctuation. The child has never heard of Hvafl, not by name, not the courtly version with catapults and feathered bishops, not the stone-hewn tradition carved beneath cloisters, not the traveling diplomacy of berry tokens and listening boards. But she has found a small wooden disc, pale and smooth under the floorboard of her grandmother's cottage. And something about it feels important, like a piece in a puzzle the world forgot. So she gathers others, pebbles of different colors, twigs snapped into short lines, a dried petal shaped vaguely like a queen. She draws a grid in the soft dirt with her finger, just 9 squares at first, then 16, then 36. She doesn't know why, only that it feels right. Then she plays, against herself, against the wind, against a bird who seems very interested but refuses to follow the rules. She names the pieces, assigns them powers, tells them stories. She hums a tune, soft and shapeless, something she's never heard before, but somehow already knows. Her father watches from the window, smiling. He remembers a song once sung in a tavern about a goat who wore a crown. Her grandmother peeks in, too, and mutters something about those old monastery boys and their apricot chess. She doesn't remember the rules either, but she remembers the warmth. A few days later, the child teaches the game to her neighbor. They play in the shade of the tree. They argue gently over whether the twig can leap. They decide it can, but only once per game, and only if you say, please. More children join. More rules are made. More rules are forgotten. A boy introduces a shell that causes all other pieces to dance. A girl insists the winner must tell a story instead of claiming a prize. Their laughter rings through the orchard, and somewhere deep in the soil, the roots of the tree hold, still listening. Not surprised, only pleased. Because Hvafl was never meant to be kept. It was always a kind of knowing, a way of speaking that lives beneath the surface, waiting for someone somewhere to remember that moving gently can be a kind of strength, that games can be bridges, that peace can begin with a pebble. No museums hold its rules, no nation claims its origin, but the game sleeps on, in stories, in lullabies, in the hush between laughter and forgiveness, and in the hands of those who pick up a token, whatever shape, whatever size, and look across a board, however drawn at someone different, and say, "Shall we play?" And now, dear listener, the world dims again. The last token has been placed. The final board rests not in victory but in peace, a soft quiet made from laughter, thoughtfulness, and tiny intentional moves. You've walked with warriors who learned to listen, monks who played instead of preached, and children who redrew the rules just to see what kindness might do next. And through it all you've stayed, listening gently, breathing slowly, letting the story guide your thoughts into still waters. Now the fire in the hearth has gone to embers. The apricot pieces have softened into memory, and outside beneath stars that have seen all the games ever played and all the dreams ever dreamt, the wind is calm. It rustles through the ivy just once like the closing line of a bedtime poem. There is nothing left to do tonight, no move to make, no line to read, only rest. So let your breath fall into rhythm like footsteps retreating from a board game well played. Let your thoughts drift like goats asleep in distant hills. Let the quiet hold you gently like moss underfoot or warm parchment in waiting hands. The game will be here tomorrow. But for now it is night, and your only task is to let go, to sleep, to dream, to drift.